Ruth Ford stepped down off the stage in Coyle's Crossing, wearing her only good dress, and the whole street went quiet. Not with welcome, with pity. She was a plain woman. Travel had not been kind to her. The dust of 3 days sat in the seams of her gray dress and along the part of her dark hair. Her face was long and honest and unremarkable, the kind of face a person forgets by supper. And the women outside the mercantile looked at her the way you look at a horse a neighbor overpaid for. They counted her plainness. They did the sum out loud, in whispers, and the sum came out low. "That's the one of them said. "That's what Wesley Ford sent away for." "He settled," said another. "A man that lonely, he'll take what comes." Ruth heard it, every word. And she did not lower her eyes. 3 weeks later, at the church social, the matron of the valley would stand up before 40 seated guests and say it plainer still. Delphine Aldous had a voice built to carry, and she used it. "Poor Wesley," she said, loud enough for the whole long table. "A man buys a wife by mail, he gets the bottom of the barrel." Ruth kept eating. She did not flinch. She thanked the hostess when she was done. Now here is what none of them knew. Not Delphine. Not the women on the porch. Not one soul in that valley who had already decided what Ruth Ford was worth. 3 weeks after that supper, the Grady gang would come. The same men who had burned 4 homesteads to the ground that summer. The men whose name made grown ranchers bar their doors and load their guns and pray. They would ride up the Ford Road in broad daylight, 11 strong, meaning to burn the place down with Ruth and Wesley inside it. And their leader would look at Ruth's plain, forgettable face. And he would go white. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, if someone once counted you cheap and never bothered to learn what you were made of, then this story is for you. Before we ride any further, do this one thing. Subscribe so the valley doesn't lose you before the ending. And leave a comment telling me the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story rides. Go on. I'll wait. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. The advertisement had run 3 weeks in a paper out of Santa Fe. Wesley Ford, rancher of Coyle's Crossing, seeks a wife of steady character. He was a widower. He was 38 years old. He had lost his first wife to a fever 2 winters gone, and he had spent those 2 winters talking to no one but his cattle and his God, and he had grown tired of the sound of his own voice in an empty house. Ruth answered it from a place she would not name. Her letter was short. She wrote a plain hand. She said she was 26, that she could keep a house and a garden and a set of books, that she asked for no romance and expected none, and that she wanted quiet above all things. She did not say where she came from. She did not say the name she was leaving behind. She signed it Ruth Rourke, and when the day came that she would sign a new one, she was glad to be rid of the old. She rode 200 miles to marry a man she had never seen. Wesley met the stage himself. He had put on his good coat, and it did not fit him well anymore, because grief and work had taken the flesh off him. He stood at the edge of the street with his hat in his hands, turning the brim, and when Ruth came down the step he knew her at once, because she was the only woman on the coach traveling alone, and because she looked straight at him the way the letter had. He was ashamed before he even said hello. That was the truth of Wesley Ford. He looked at this woman who had crossed half the territory on his word, and the first thing he felt was that he was not enough for the trouble. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm Ford. The ranch is a ways out. It isn't much. I want to say that plain, before you've come too far to turn around. The house is my father's house. The furniture is my first wife's furniture. I never got around to changing any of it. It's dusty. The whole place is dusty. I should have had it swept." Ruth looked at him, at the ill-fitting coat and the turning hat and the honest, worn-down face of a man apologizing for himself in the middle of the street. "Mr. Ford," she said, "I didn't come for the furniture." They were married that afternoon by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing, in the front room of the preacher's boarding house, with the landlady and her grown son as the only witnesses. Ruth wore the gray dress. Wesley wore the coat that didn't fit. The preacher read the words, and Wesley said his part in a low voice, and Ruth said hers evenly. And when it was done, the landlady gave them a slice of cake each, and that was the wedding. The valley heard about it inside a week. And inside a week, the valley decided. They decided Wesley Ford had settled. That was the word. It moved from the mercantile to the church to the feedlot, and it did not change on the way. He was a lonely man, they said, and a lonely man takes what he can get, and what he'd gotten was a plain, quiet, mail-order woman with no people and no beauty and no dowry to speak of. They pitied him for it. They pitied him to his face, some of them, in that soft, cruel way that pretends to be kindness. Wesley did not pity himself. That was the first thing Ruth learned about her husband that made her glad she'd come. It happened at the mercantile, the second week. Ruth had gone in for thread and a paper of needles. Wesley waited by the counter. And two of the porch women had followed them in, the way people follow a thing they mean to talk about, and one of them said to the other, not quite under her breath, "Well, she'll give him plain children at least. Nothing to spoil." Wesley Ford was not a hard man. In all the time Ruth knew him, she never once saw him raise his hand to a living thing. But he set down the sack he was holding, and he turned, and he looked at the two women until they stopped smiling. "My wife," he said, "is standing right there, and she can hear you as well as I can. You've been in my family's church since before I was born. I'd have thought that bought a little manners." He picked the sack back up. It doesn't seem to have. The women went red and went out. And Wesley did not look at Ruth to see if she'd been pleased by it. That was the thing. He hadn't done it to be seen doing it. He'd done it because it was owed, and he'd have done it for a stranger. He did not yet know one true thing about her. Not where she was from, not whose blood she carried. Nothing. He defended her in the dark, on nothing but the fact that she was his and she was being wronged. Ruth carried that home with her, quiet, and did not say anything about it. But something in her had eased that had not eased in a long time. The ranch was as poor as he'd warned her. Poorer, maybe. It sat in a fold of the valley with the mountains behind it. Good grass and better water, but the house was old, and the barn wanted a new roof, and the whole place had the thin, stretched look of land that is worth more than the man on it can hold. There was a mortgage. Wesley told her about it the third night, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, because he'd decided she had a right to know what she'd married into. "I owe money on the water rights," he said. "Not the land, the water. My father borrowed against it in a bad year, and I've never got clear of it. Man named Pike holds the note now. Harlan Pike. He's got the Cattlemen's Trust, out of the county seat." Wesley turned his coffee cup a slow half-turn on the wood. "I'll make it right. I always have. I just wanted you to know it's there." "How much?" Ruth asked. $1,180. He said the number like it hurt him. "It might as well be the moon. Some months." She nodded. She did not tell him it frightened her, because it didn't, quite. She had seen worse numbers written in worse hands. She only tucked it away, the way she tucked everything away. And she said, "Then we'll work it," and Wesley looked at her across the lamp like she'd handed him something. She unpacked her trunk that same week. She did not have much. 2 dresses besides the gray one. A Bible with her mother's name in it. A good wool shawl. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a bit of cord, a bundle she had carried 200 miles and never once opened on the road. Wesley was helping her. He meant well. He lifted the bundle out before she could reach it, and the oilcloth fell open in his hands. It was a revolver. Not a farm gun. Not a rusted thing kept for snakes and coyotes. It was a fine piece, oiled and cared for, the metal dark and clean, the bone grip worn smooth by a hand that had held it a great many times. And when Wesley turned it toward the lamp, he saw the 3 notches filed careful into the grip, one below the other, and the 2 letters cut deep into the backstrap where a man would set his thumb. C.R. Wesley Ford had lived his whole life in that country. He knew what notches on a grip meant. He knew that men who carried guns like that were not men who farmed. He held it a moment too long, and something moved behind his face, some question he did not quite dare to shape. Ruth took it from his hands. Gently, she wrapped the oilcloth back around it and tied the cord and set it back down in the bottom of the trunk. "It was my father's," she said. "I'd like it kept in the trunk." That was all she gave him. "It was my father's." Wesley waited for more. She could see him waiting. She could see the question sitting right there behind his teeth. Whose initials? What father? 3 notches for what? And to his everlasting credit, and maybe to his cost, he did not ask it. He looked at his plain, quiet wife, and he decided that a woman was allowed to keep one thing to herself, and he let it lie. "All right," he said. "It'll stay in the trunk." And he never asked again. Not for a long time. That was the kind of man he was, and it was the kind of thing that would nearly get them both killed, and also the kind of thing that would save everything. But we're not there yet. Harlan Pike came to the ranch himself. That was the part that told Ruth what sort of man he was. A banker who sends a clerk with a notice is doing business. A banker who rides out personally, in a good coat, on a good horse, to hand you the paper with his own gloved hand and watch your face while you read it. That is a man who enjoys the reading. He came on a bright morning near the end of the harvest. He sat his horse in the yard and he did not get down, and he smiled the whole time. "Ford," he said. "Fine morning. I won't keep you from your work." He drew a folded paper from his coat and leaned down and held it out, and Wesley had to walk over and take it. "Just making my rounds, keeping everything neighborly and clear. You'll find it's all in order." Wesley unfolded it. Ruth stood in the doorway of the house and watched her husband's shoulders go still. 60 days, Wesley said. By first frost, Pike agreed pleasantly. 1180, principal and interest, or the trust takes the water rights per the note your father signed. It's nothing personal, Ford. It's only business. I do hope you'll come current. I truly do. He touched his hat brim to Wesley and then, with a little extra courtesy that was somehow the worst part, to Ruth in the doorway. "Ma'am, my congratulations on the marriage." He turned his horse and rode out easy, in no hurry at all, a man who owned the time. Wesley stood in the yard holding the paper. When Ruth came out to him, he handed it to her without a word, and she read it, and she understood several things at once that she did not yet say aloud. She understood that $1,180 in 60 days was very nearly impossible for a ranch like theirs. She understood that Harlan Pike knew that. And she understood, from the pleasure in the man's smile, that he was not truly worried about getting his money back. He wanted the water. He wanted the land the water fed. A man like that does not ride out smiling because he fears a loss. He rides out smiling because he already sees the win. "We'll work it," Ruth said again, because Wesley needed to hear it. But she folded the notice very small, and she kept her eyes on the road where Pike had gone. And something cold and old and careful woke up in the back of her mind, and began, quietly, to think. There was one more thing pressing on the valley that autumn, and it was worse than any banker. The Grady gang had come to the country in the spring, and by harvest they had burned 4 homesteads. They came at night, mostly, and they came for the edges first, the small places, the families with no near neighbors, and no way to call for help. They would fire the barn and shoot the stock and put a bullet or a torch into whatever stood in their way, and they would ride off before the smoke was even seen. Twice they'd killed. The men who'd stood their ground were dead, and the men who'd run were alive, and everyone in the valley had done that arithmetic. Here was the part that made Ruth's cold, careful mind sit up. Every family the Gradys burned out sold their scorched land for pennies and left. And every one of those parcels, every single one, was bought up inside a month by the Cattlemen's Trust. By Harlan Pike. She did not say that to Wesley either. Not yet. She only watched and counted and remembered the way she had been raised to do by a man whose gun sat wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk. The harvest social came at the end of September. It was the biggest gathering of the year, and Wesley did not want to go, and Ruth made him. "They'll talk about us whether we sit at home or not," she said. "I'd sooner give them my face to talk to than my back." So they went. There was a long table set up in the meeting hall, and roasted meat and pies and cider, and 40 people or better, all the valley families in their good clothes. And Delphine Aldous ran it. Delphine Aldous ran everything. She was a broad, handsome, iron-corseted woman with a voice that could reach the back pew without effort, and she had appointed herself, some years back, the keeper of who belonged in Coyle's Crossing, and who did not. She decided the seating. She decided it every year, and she seated Ruth Ford at the very foot of the table, down among the children and the hired hands, as far from the head as the room allowed. Ruth took the seat without a word. She had been given lower seats than that in her life. It might have passed. The meal was nearly done. And then Delphine, warm with cider and with the pleasure of a full room hanging on her, rose up to say a few words of welcome to the new faces of the year, and there were only 2 new faces, and one of them was Ruth. And of course, Delphine said, sweeping a hand down the long table, "We welcome Wesley Ford's new bride." She let it sit. She let the room look. And then she smiled, and she delivered the line she had been saving, loud and round and clear enough to carry to the last child at the far end. Though I will say, poor Wesley. A man buys a wife by mail, he gets the bottom of the barrel. The room laughed. Not all of it, but enough. A rancher's grown son barked out loud, and a woman near the middle put her hand to her chest and said, in that soft poisoned voice, "Oh, but pity the plain little things she'll give him. Plain mother, plain children. Nothing there to spoil is there." And she laughed too. 40 people. Ruth would remember the number the rest of her life. 40 people, in their good clothes, laughing or letting the laughing happen, at a plain, quiet woman who had done nothing to any of them but marry a lonely man and come to their table. Ruth set down her fork. She did not stand up in a rush. She did not color. She did not let one thing move in her face that they could take home and repeat. She laid her fork down beside her plate, square and quiet, and she folded her napkin, and she rose. She looked down the length of that table at Delphine Aldous, and she said, in a voice pitched low and perfectly even, so that the whole room had to go quiet to catch it, "Thank you for the supper, Mrs. Aldous. It was a fine spread." And she walked out. Chin level. Not fast, not slow. She walked the length of the hall and out the door into the cool September dark, and she did not once look back to see what her face had cost them, because she would not give them even that. There was a silence behind her. And into that silence, Wesley Ford stood up. He was not a man who spoke in rooms. He had sat through his own share of their pity, with his head down and his jaw tight. But he stood up now, slow, and he set his hands on the table, and he looked around at the 40 of them, at Delphine, at the laughing son, at the woman with her hand to her chest. "That woman," he said, "came 200 miles on my word alone, to a poor man on a poor ranch, and she has not asked me for one thing since she came but quiet. She keeps my house. She works beside me from first light. She's shown me more plain kindness in 3 weeks than this whole valley's shown either of us in a year." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You've shamed yourselves tonight. Not her. Her you couldn't touch. But you Every one of you that laughed, you go home and think on what kind of people laugh at a stranger for being plain and being poor and being new. Because that's all she is guilty of. And I married her. And I'd do it again tomorrow. And I'd do it in front of every one of you. He picked up his hat. Nobody said a word. Delphine Aldous, for once in her life, had nothing loaded. Wesley walked out after his wife. He found her by the wagon. She was standing very straight in the dark, looking up at the stars over the mountains, and when he came up beside her she did not turn. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have spoke sooner. I should have spoke the first week." "You spoke fine," Ruth said. Her voice was steady. Only he was close enough to hear the smallest thread in it, the thing she'd carried out of the hall folded up small like the mortgage notice. "You've a good voice for it when you use it." He helped her up into the wagon. They rode home under the stars and did not talk much, and the not talking was easy, which is a rare thing between two people, and rarer between two who've known each other 3 weeks. When they got home, Ruth lit the lamp and Wesley banked the stove, and before they slept, she stood a moment at the trunk in the corner of the room, and she rested her hand flat on the closed lid, on the wood above where the oilcloth bundle lay. She did not open it. She only rested her hand there a moment, the way you might touch a thing to remind yourself it's real. Then she went to bed. The valley did not get better after that night. It got worse, and it got worse fast, and it did not get worse because of anything the Fords did. It was the Cutter place that burned. 2 weeks after the social. The Cutters had a homestead on the north edge of the valley, a good family, 3 children, and they had been the loudest at the meetings about standing firm against the gratis and not selling out to the trust. And in the black middle of an October night, the gang came for them. The Fords saw the glow from their own yard, miles off, a smear of orange under the low clouds. Wesley was saddled and gone before Ruth could say a word, riding for it with 2 other men who'd seen the light, and Ruth stood in the yard in her nightdress with a shawl over her shoulders and watched the orange grow, and knew, the way you know a thing in your stomach, that they were too late before they started. They were too late. Wesley came home gray at dawn. The barn was gone, and the house was half gone, and the oldest Cutter boy had taken a bullet through the arm, and the hired man was dead in the yard where he'd tried to stand. The gang had left a board propped where the gate had been, and burned into it with a running iron were 3 words: sell or burn. The valley men mustered a posse, 20 of them, angry and frightened, and they rode out 3 days into the hills and found exactly nothing. Because the Gradys knew that country the way the valley men knew their own kitchens. And a posse of scared ranchers is a slow, loud, useless thing against men who kill for a living. They came home with sore backs and their pride in worse shape and a new understanding. Unspoken, that no one was coming to save them. Not the county. Not the marshal, 40 miles off and 1 man. Not each other. Ruth watched all of it. She fed the men when they came through. She listened. She said very little. But at night, she began to sleep the way she had trained herself to sleep long ago, in a house she never spoke of, light and ready, with 1 ear open, and that was how she heard the rider. It was a few evenings after the posse gave up. Dusk, the light going long in gold across the yard, the mountains gone blue behind. Wesley was out at the far fence mending wire. Ruth was in the house. And she heard, under the ordinary evening sounds, the wrong sound. A horse where a horse should not be. Off past the corral, out in the brush at the edge of the Ford land, moving slow. Circling. She went to the window and did not stand in front of it. She stood beside it, in the shadow, the way you stand when you do not want to be seen looking, and she watched. There was a man on a horse 200 yards out, at the edge of the scrub. He was not coming in. He was sitting his horse easy and looking the place over, looking at the barn, and the house, and the corral where Wesley's 2 saddle horses stood, scouting it, counting it. The way you look at a thing before you burn it. Ruth knew what he was. She had grown up among men who rode like that and looked like that and did exactly that before a night's work. He was a Grady outrider, and he was measuring the Ford ranch for the fire. She did not call out to Wesley. Wesley was at the far fence, unarmed, with his back half to the man, and if she called he'd come at a run into the open, and that was the worst thing she could do. She did not run. She did not make a sound. She went to the corner of the room. She knelt at the trunk, and she opened the lid, quiet, and she moved aside the shawl and the folded dresses, and she lifted out the long shape that was not the oilcloth bundle, the rifle, the good long rifle she'd wrapped and carried the same 200 miles and never once spoken of. She loaded it standing, without looking at her hands, because her hands had done it 10,000 times and did not need her eyes. Then she opened the front door, and she stepped out onto the porch into the last of the gold light, and she raised the rifle to her shoulder. The outrider saw her come out. Ruth could see him see her, a woman, in an apron, in the doorway of the house they meant to burn. He was 200 yards off, and he was not troubled by her. Why would he be? A rancher's wife, plain and small, at that distance, holding a gun she surely couldn't use. He sat his horse and watched her the way you watch a scolding you don't have to mind. And out at the far fence, Wesley straightened up from the wire and saw his wife on the porch with a rifle to her shoulder, and saw the rider beyond her, and opened his mouth to shout, and never got the word out. Because Ruth Ford breathed out, slow, the way she had been taught before she could read, and between one heartbeat and the next, with no hurry and no waver and no word at all, she fired. 200 yards, dusk, off a standing shot. And the outrider's hat leapt off his head as clean as if a hand had plucked it, spun once in the gold air, and dropped in the brush behind him. She had not fired at the man. She wanted that understood, later, by the only person who mattered. She had not fired at the man. She had fired 1 inch above him, at a scrap of felt, at a distance no farm wife in the territory could have hit on her best day with a week to aim. She had taken his hat off his head to tell him one thing, in the only language his kind respected: I could have taken your head just as easy. Ride, and then she lowered the barrel. The outrider did not ride. For 1 whole second he did not do anything at all. He sat frozen, bare-headed, staring at the small plain woman on the porch, and whatever he had thought he was looking at, he was not looking at it anymore. Then he wheeled his horse so hard it near went down, and he put the spurs to it, and he bolted for the hills like the devil himself had leaned out of that doorway, and in a way, though he didn't yet have the name for it, one had. Ruth watched him go until he was gone. Then she opened the rifle, and she cleaned it, standing there on the porch in the dying light, unhurried, and she carried it back inside. Wesley came in from the fence at a dead run. He came through the door white and breathing hard, and he found his wife at the kitchen table, wiping down the barrel of a rifle with an oiled rag, calm as if she were shelling peas. Ruth. He could barely get it out. Ruth. That shot. That was. A man can't make that shot. I've hunted this country 20 years, and I can't make that shot. Where in God's name did you? She set the rag down. She looked up at him, her plain honest face gone very still and very gentle, and for a moment, just a moment, it was not the face of a rancher's mail-order wife at all. It was something older and colder and sadder, something she had come 200 miles to bury. Wesley, she said quietly, don't ask me tonight. And he didn't. God help him, he didn't. He stood there in his own kitchen, looking at the stranger he'd married, and he swallowed every question in him, and he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and after a while he said, "All right." Just that. All right. By morning the story was already loose in the valley, the way stories are. carried by the two men who'd been at the far fences of their own places and seen a hatless rider tearing out of the Ford land like his mount was afire. And the valley, being the valley, did what it always did with anything that didn't fit the size of Ruth Ford they'd already decided on. They called it luck. A wild shot. A frightened woman who happened to fling a bullet in the right direction and scare off a scout. Delphine Aldous herself was heard to say that it only went to show the Lord watched over fools and plain women. And the mercantile porch laughed. And the matter was settled. The way they settled everything, comfortably and wrong. But out in the hills, in a camp among the rocks where 11 hard men waited on their leader's word, a bareheaded outrider was telling a different story. He was telling it low, and he was telling it careful. Because he had seen something in that doorway at 200 yards that had put a cold hand on the back of his neck, and he could not shake it, and he did not have the name for it. He kept coming back to the woman's face. The plain, forgettable, impossible face over the barrel of that rifle. He would put a name to it soon enough. And in 3 days, in the bright light of an autumn morning, Silas Grady himself would come up the Ford Road with 10 men at his back and fire in his eyes to burn the place to the ground. And he would look at that same plain face standing in that same doorway. And everything in the valley was about to change. The bareheaded rider came into camp at dusk and could not eat. Silas Grady watched him from across the fire, and Silas Grady was a patient man in the way that snakes are patient. He let the boy sit. He let him turn his coffee cup in his hands and stare into it like there was an answer down in the grounds. Then he said, "Lo, you lost your hat." "She took it," the outrider said. "A woman took your hat." 200 yards, Silas, near dark. One shot. She didn't aim like she was scared. She aimed like she was bored. He set the cup down and his hand was not steady. "I've seen men shoot. I've never seen that. She put it clean off my head, and then she just lowered the gun. Like she'd decided not to take the rest of me." Some of the men laughed. Grady did not. Grady had lived his whole hard life on the reading of small things, and something in the boy's face was ringing a bell far back in his memory, in a room he kept locked. He asked what she looked like. The boy told him. Plain, brown hair. Nothing you'd turn to look at twice. And Grady frowned, because that was no help at all, and he let it go, and he told them they would ride on the Ford place in 3 days and burn it like the others, and the boy went pale and said nothing. Down in the valley, the mortgage came due faster. Harlan Pike rode out to the Ford ranch himself. 2 days after the shot the town was still laughing about. He came in a good coat on a good horse, and he sat it in the yard and did not get down, and he smiled the smile he used for foreclosures and Sunday both. Wesley came out wiping his hands. Ruth came to the door and stayed there. "Wesley," Pike said. "Bad business all up and down the valley. Cutter place burned, folks selling out cheap and moving on. A man in my position has to think about his paper." He drew an envelope from his coat. "The trust has decided it can't carry the Ford note to First Frost after all. 30 days, Wesley. 1,180. Cash. In 30 days. Or the water rights come to us. Only business. You understand." Wesley took the envelope like it was hot. "You moved it up. You can't just—" "I can, son. It's in the terms. Small print, but it's there." Pike touched his hat brim toward the door. "Mrs. Ford," and he turned his horse and rode out easy, a man who had never once in his life been made to hurry. Ruth watched him go all the way to the road. She was not looking at his back. She was looking at the fresh sign in the dust where his horse had turned, and past that, at the tracks along the fence line she had walked out to read that same morning before the sun was full up. She had knelt at the fence in the gray light with her skirt in the dirt and put 2 fingers beside a hoof print the way a woman might touch a wound. Wesley had found her there. He didn't understand what he was seeing. His wife, reading the ground. 3 horses, she'd said, not looking up. Came in the night before last, along the wash where the ground stays soft. Sat here a good while. See how deep the near hind cut? He shifted his weight. He was watching the house long enough his horse got tired of standing. She stood and brushed her knees. They've measured us, Wesley. They know how many head, how many hands, where the wind comes from for the fire. They know we're only two. Wesley had said, "How do you know how to?" and stopped, because he had promised himself he would not ask, and because her face had closed like a door, and he had learned by now what that closing meant. "I had a hard raising," was all she said, and walked back to the house. So the 30 days began, and neither of them believed the money would come, and neither of them said so. The valley did what valleys do. The men mustered a posse after the cutter burning, and rode out in a knot with their old rifles and their loud talk, and they found nothing, because you do not find men like the Grady gang unless the Grady gang wants finding. They came back and drank at the mercantile and told each other they'd shown the outlaws the valley had teeth. Delphine Aldous told the women that the Fords would be the next to sell, and it was a shame, though of course a plain wife and a mortgaged ranch, one couldn't be surprised. The town settled the Fords into the ground they'd already dug for them. And on the third morning, in the clean bright light of an autumn day, the dust came up the Ford road. Ruth saw it first. She was pinning wash to the line, and she stopped with a clothespin in her mouth and stood very still, watching the smear of it rise over the low ground where the road bent. She took the pin out of her mouth. She did not run. She counted. 11. Wesley, she said. Just his name, but he came out of the barn at the sound of it, and he followed her eyes, and the blood went out of his face. 11 riders, coming at a walk, in no hurry at all, the way men ride when they mean to be somewhere a while and don't care who sees them come. "Get in the house," he said. "Ruth, get in the house and bar it." She looked at him. There was something in her face he had never seen, and would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and never quite manage. It was not fear. It was a kind of weary arithmetic, a woman totting up a bill she had known for years would come. "No," she said. "Stand behind me, Wesley, and whatever happens, don't reach for a gun. Not for anything. Ruth, trust me, one time, don't reach." And she walked out from under the wash line and stood in the middle of her own yard in her apron, with the wind moving her skirt. And she folded her hands in front of her, and she waited for 11 armed men to ride up to her. They came into the yard and spread in a loose half-circle the way wolves do, easy, taking their time. Wesley stood behind his wife with his empty hands hanging and his heart going like a hammer. He could smell them now. Horse and sweat and old smoke. The smell of men who burned things. At the center of them a big man on a gray horse pushed forward, and the others gave him room, and Wesley knew without being told this was Silas Grady, the name that had emptied 4 homes that summer. Grady looked at the ranch. He looked at the barn and the house and the good water in the ditch, measuring it all for the fire. Then he looked, without much interest, at the woman standing in the yard. And he stopped. Wesley watched it happen and did not understand it. He watched the big man's face, which had been idle and cruel, go slack. He watched Grady lean forward in the saddle and squint and lean back. The gray horse felt the change in its rider and sidestepped, and Grady didn't correct it. He was staring at Ruth's plain face like a man staring at a ghost that had walked up out of his own grave. "No," Grady said, quiet, to himself. "No, it can't be." Ruth said nothing. She lifted her chin, just a little, just enough, and something in that small motion, that tilt of a plain jaw, finished whatever the face had started, and Silas Grady went white to the lips. "Say your name," he said, and his voice had gone hoarse. "You know my name," Ruth said. "You knew it before I said a word." The men were shifting now, looking at each other, not understanding, hands drifting toward their guns because their leader had gone strange, and men like that reach for iron when they're afraid. Grady put up a hand without turning his head, and every hand stopped. "Boys," Silas Grady said, and he said it slow, the way you'd talk in a room where something might go off. "Take a good long look. And then get it out of your heads that you ever saw this place." He wet his lips. "That ain't a rancher's wife. Look at her. That's Cole Rourke's girl. That's the wolf's daughter, standing right there in the dirt." His horse turned under him, and he let it, backing it away, keeping his eyes on Ruth like she might vanish if he blinked. "We were never here. You hear me? There was no Ford place. There's no Ford place in the whole valley. Turn around." One of the younger men, who didn't know the name, laughed and said, "Silas, it's one woman and a dirt farmer, we can." Grady turned on him so fast the young man flinched. "You want to be the one who put a bullet in Cole Rourke's blood?" he said. "You want him coming across that border looking for you? For the rest of your natural life, which would be short. I rode with the man 20 years ago, and I owe him the fact that I'm breathing, and I will not spend that debt burning his daughter's house. Now turn your horse, or I'll shoot you off it myself." The young man turned his horse. They wheeled and rode off the Ford land the way they'd come, only faster, no hurry left in them at all. 11 men fleeing a plain woman in an apron who had not moved from the middle of her yard. The dust rose and drifted and settled. And they never touched the valley again. Not the Fords. Not the Cutters who came back. Not any homestead under that sky. The burnings ended that morning, in that yard, with a tilt of a chin. Wesley stood behind his wife and could not make his voice work. Ruth watched the dust go all the way down the road and out of sight. Then her shoulders came down from around her ears, and she let out a breath that seemed to come up from her boots. And she turned around, and she was just Ruth again, plain and tired and standing in her own yard. "I think," she said, "I'd better tell you some things." The town could not make it fit. That was the trouble. The story came down out of the hills the way all stories did, carried by a Ford hand who'd watched it from the corral rails, and it made no sense to a single soul who heard it. The Grady gang, the men who'd left a body at the Cutter place, who'd burned 4 families down to the ground for their land, had ridden into the plainest, poorest, most pitiable little ranch in the county, and looked at the plainest, poorest, most pitiable woman in it, and turned around and rode away, and never came back. Men chewed on it at the mercantile and could not swallow it. Delphine Aldous said it must have been a trick, or a bribe, or that Wesley had made some deal with the devil to save his sorry water rights, because there was no other explaining it, and the plain Ford woman certainly had nothing to do with it. It was the old freighter who put the name to it. He'd hauled goods across the border 100 times. An old man now, gray and dried out and afraid of very little, and he was on the mercantile porch when they were arguing it. He listened. He asked the hand to say again what Grady had called her. The hand said it. Cole Rourke's girl. The wolf's daughter. And the old freighter, who had faced down river pirates and comancheros and a bad death more than once, went the color of ash. He set down his cup. He said, "Say that again," and the hand said it again, and the old man stood up like his knees hurt and looked off toward the Ford place with an expression the porch had never seen on him. "Then God help every fool in this valley that ever spoke ill of her," he said. "Because there is not a man who rides that border country, outlaw or lawman or Indian or priest, who would lift one finger against Cole Rourke's blood. He is the most feared man on the whole line and has been for 30 years. They call him the Border Wolf. I have seen grown killers cross themselves at the sound of his name." He picked up his hat. "And you people sat that man's daughter at the foot of your tables and called her the bottom of the barrel." He walked off the porch and did not come back, and behind him the porch was very quiet, and the quiet spread through the valley like cold water finding low ground. At the Ford kitchen that night Wesley had finally asked, gentle, across the same table where he'd once said only all right, and Ruth had told him the whole of it. That her name was Rourke before it was Ford. That her father was the man the freighter named, and that she had grown up on the wrong side of everything, learning to shoot before she learned to read, learning that her father's name was a wall that kept the world off her, and also a wall that kept her in. That the pistol in the trunk, the bone handle, the 3 notches, the CR, cut into the backstrap, that was his, given to her the day she left, the day she told him she wanted a life where nobody knew whose girl she was. A quiet life. A plain one. Somewhere the name couldn't follow. And it followed anyway, she said. It always does. Wesley reached across the table and put his rough hand over hers, and did not say anything for a while. And then he said the thing she had not known she was waiting 8 weeks to hear. I didn't marry a name, he said. I married the woman who read the sign at my fence and stood in my yard so I wouldn't have to. I'd have kept you if your father was a preacher or a horse thief or nobody at all. He turned her hand over in his. The plainness never mattered to me, Ruth. Not the first day. Not now. I want you to know that. Before any of this. It never once mattered. And Ruth Ford, who had faced 11 armed men without a tremble, put her face down on the table and wept, and Wesley let her, and outside the water ran quiet in the ditch that Harlan Pike was still trying to take. But Harlan Pike, sitting up late in his office over the Cattleman's Trust with the Ford note in front of him, had done the same arithmetic the freighter did, and it had turned his stomach to ice. Because Harlan Pike had a secret, and his secret was this: the raids were his. He had sat across a table in a back room and paid Silas Grady in gold to burn the valley's edge, homestead by homestead, so that the frightened families would sell their land to the trust for pennies on the dollar, and Pike would own the water and the grass from the mountains to the flat. It was a good plan. It was a lawful-looking, patient banker's plan, and it had worked on 4 families already. And the next family on the list, the ranch whose water rights he'd already forged a survey to steal, whose deadline he'd moved up to break them faster, was the Ford place. Was Cole Rourke's daughter's home. Pike sat in his good office and understood, slowly and completely, that he had spent a summer stealing the one piece of ground in the territory a wise man would have walked 10 miles around. He had paid to burn out the wolf's own blood. And there was not enough money in his vault, in any vault, to buy back from that. He told himself money was money. He told himself a name was just a name, that this was 1878 and not the old days, that the law was the law, and he was a man of business standing on paper. He told himself that until the papers came down from the border. They came the week of the quarter session, when the circuit judge was in Coyle's Crossing to hear the cases that had piled up since spring. The town hall was full, because the town hall was always full when the judge came. It was theater, it was the season's entertainment, and the same 40 souls who had watched Delphine humble Ruth at the harvest social packed the benches to watch justice get done. The rider who came down from the border was not a gunman. That was the thing nobody expected. He was a lawyer, a neat, dry man in a black coat with a leather case, and he asked the judge's leave to enter 2 matters into the record on behalf of an interested party, and the judge, curious, gave it. The first was a surveyor's affidavit and a true plat of the Ford water rights, laid beside the survey Pike's Trust had filed, and any man with eyes could see one was a forgery of the other. The corners moved, the creek redrawn, the whole theft written down in a clerk's careful hand. The lawyer laid it before the judge, without heat, the way you'd lay down a winning card. Slow. The second was a deposition. Sworn, witnessed, signed with a shaking hand by a man who'd ridden with the Grady gang and wanted the border's mercy more than he wanted Pike's gold, and it named Harlan Pike. Named him as the man who paid, in a back room, in gold, to burn 4 homesteads and drive the valley to sell. Named the dates. Named the sums. Pike came up off his bench white and sweating. "This is, Your Honor. This is slander. This is some trick. I am a man of standing in this. Sit down, Mr. Pike," the judge said, reading, "Money is money, Your Honor." "I hold that note lawfully. I have the paper. A man's paper is his, your paper," said the judge, still reading, "appears to be a forgery, and your gold appears to have bought 4 fires and 1 dead man at the Cutter place. Sit down before I have you held for that too." He looked up, and he looked at Pike over his spectacles the way a schoolmaster looks at a boy caught stealing, and the whole hall was silent. "The note is void. The Ford water rights are quieted in the name of Wesley and Ruth Ford, free of any claim by the Cattlemen's Trust. And you, sir, will remain in this county to answer to the United States Marshal on the matter of these raids. Deputy, his coat and his freedom, if you please." And that was all. No shot fired, no gun hand from the border, no wolf come down out of the hills, only a dry lawyer, a forged map, and 1 frightened outlaw's sworn word, and the lawful machinery of a circuit court doing what it was built to do. The border's shadow had not killed Harlan Pike. It had only opened the door and let the law walk in. Pike sat down hard on the bench with his neat plans in ashes around him, and the same 40 people who had pitied Ruth Ford watched a marshal's deputy take the banker's arm, and not one of them was looking at Pike. They were all looking at Ruth, who sat in the back in her only good dress, hands folded, watching without a flicker. The reversal, when it came quiet, the way she'd have wanted it. It came at the mercantile porch, 3 days after the session, on a bright cold morning. Ruth walked up the step to buy flour and coffee, and the women who were gathered there, the same women who had counted her plain and found her wanting, who had clucked over poor settled Wesley. The women went still, and then they parted. They stepped back from the door and made a lane for her the way you'd make room for a thing you were afraid to touch. Delphine Aldous stood at the center of them. Ruth went in and bought her flour. She came back out with it on her hip. And Delphine Aldous, who had never in her life been at a loss for a word, opened her mouth to say something, some kindness, some crawling little repair of all the cruelty, some remark about the weather, and found that she could not. Nothing came. She stood there, with her mouth open and her face working, and no sound in her at all, because there is no sentence in the language that walks back what she had done, and some deep animal part of her knew now exactly whose daughter she had shamed at the foot of her table. Ruth looked at her. Not unkind. Not kind either. Just level, the way she'd looked at 11 armed men. "I'll take a pound of coffee, too," she said to the storekeeper, and paid for it, and settled it in her basket, and turned to go. At the top of the step she paused, and she gave Delphine Aldous a small even nod, the courtesy you'd give a stranger. "Good morning, Mrs. Aldous," she said. And she went down the steps and up the street, and behind her on that porch the pity died where it stood. And what came up in its place, in every face there, was a thing much older and much colder, and it walked with her all the way home whether she wanted it or not. That night in the Ford kitchen the lamp was low, and the stove was warm, and the house was quiet in a way it had not been in a long time. Wesley sat at the table cleaning tack he didn't need to clean, just to have his hands busy, and Ruth went into the bedroom and came back with the bundle of oilcloth and set it on the table between them and unwrapped it. The bone handle caught the lamplight. The 3 notches. The CR cut deep into the steel. Wesley had seen it once, weeks ago, and put it away and never asked, and kept his promise all these weeks not to ask. He set down the tack. "I never told you what the notches are," Ruth said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't." She turned the pistol over in her hands, gentle, the way you'd hold something that had teeth. "They're not what you think. My father filed one for every man he could have killed, and didn't. That was his joke. Everyone thought they counted the dead. They counted the living." She set it down. 3 men in 30 years he let walk away. Silas Grady was one of them. Wesley looked at the gun a long moment. Then he did a thing that surprised them both. He reached out and picked it up, this fearful thing, this piece of the name that had married into his house, and he felt its weight, and he looked down its clean oiled length, and then he wrapped it back up in the oilcloth, careful, corner over corner, the way she'd shown him without showing him, and he carried it into the bedroom and knelt at the trunk and laid it back down in the bottom, under the folded quilts where it had always been. He came back and sat down. "There," he said. "It stays in the trunk. Same as always." He picked up his tack again. "We've got water that's ours now, and a fence needs mending in the morning, and I'd rather talk about that." And he did. And she let him, and the pistol lay in the dark of the trunk, chosen, and unused, and that was the whole of it. A year on, the frost came again. It came the way it had the year she'd stepped off the stage, silvering the grass in the low ground and smoking off the roofs when the sun found them, and the water ran cold and clear and free in the Ford ditch, down through the pasture and out to the fields, and no man's paper hung over one drop of it. The Cutter family had come home in the spring and rebuilt on their old foundation, and you could see the raw new lumber of their barn from the Ford road, going gray already, weathering in. The valley was quiet. It had been quiet a whole year. No fire on the horizon at night, no dust of hard men coming up any road, nothing to fear from the hills at all. Ruth Ford stood at her kitchen window in the first light, with her hands wrapped around a warm cup, and watched her husband cross the yard to the barn, and she was, if you had asked her, about as near to content as she had ever let herself come. The letter came that morning with the freight, along with the flour and the nails. It had no return address. It had no name on the front but hers, her married name, Mrs. Ruth Ford, in a hard black hand that pressed so deep it had near torn the paper. She knew the hand before she broke the seal. She stood by the stove and opened it, and there was one line inside, and only one. "You did fine, girl, I won't come, but I'm near." Ruth read it twice. Something moved across her face, quick, and was gone, folded away where she folded everything. Then she opened the stove door, and she laid the letter on the coals, and she watched the hard black writing curl and catch and go to nothing, and she closed the door. She stood a moment in the warm kitchen light with her hand flat on the stove's warm iron. Near, not gone. Never gone, really, but near, and choosing to stay near and no closer, which from that man was the tenderest thing he had it in him to do, and she knew it, and she let herself have it for exactly as long as it took the paper to burn. Then she picked up her cup and went back to the window and her life. The town made its own small peace with her, in its own small way. She went to the mercantile a week later for salt, and Delphine Aldous was on the porch, older looking than she had a year ago, quieter than the valley had ever known her. And as Ruth came up the step, Delphine said, "Careful, the way you'd speak to someone who could hurt you and had chosen not to. You've settled in well." Mrs. Ford and Ruth stopped and looked at her, and there was the ghost of something at the corner of her plain mouth that was not quite a smile. "I always was," she said, and went in for her salt. Of Harlan Pike the town did not say much. It didn't like to. The marshal had taken him east to answer for the raids and the dead man at the Cutter place, and the Cattlemen's Trust had found itself a new owner and a new manager who did not forge surveys or ride out to move deadlines up, and the water stayed with the ranchers. All of it, every drop, the way it always should have. When the subject came up on the mercantile porch, which was seldom, somebody would say the trust had changed hands and the water had stayed put, and somebody else would say that was a mercy, and then they would change the subject. Because there was a name underneath the whole business that nobody in that valley wanted to say out loud anymore. So that was the way of it, in Coyle's Crossing, the year the Pitied died. The plainest woman in the county turned out to be carrying the loudest name on the border, and she carried it so quiet that 40 people sat at table with her and never heard it hum. They had looked at the small size of her and decided that was the whole size of her, and they had been wrong by more than they would ever have the nerve to measure. It's a thing worth remembering, maybe, next time you're quick to count somebody out, that the ones who make the least noise are so often the ones carrying the most, and that a quiet face is not an empty one, and that you never do know, standing in a dusty street watching a plain woman step down off a stage. Whose blood is standing there in front of you, or what it can do when it finally decides to stand still in a yard and not run anymore. Wesley came in from the barn, stamping the cold off his boots, and Ruth had his coffee poured before he reached the table, and the water ran in the ditch outside that was theirs, and free, and the frost burned off the low ground the way it does, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the quiet life she'd stepped off that stage to find, and it had cost her every secret she owned to keep it, and she'd have paid it all again without blinking. If this valley reminds you of somewhere, some town that was quick to judge and slow to look close, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And stay a while. There's another story coming up the road.